Hi, I'm Brooke and I will be discussing the management of the National Elk Refuge. Before we get started, the National Elk Refuge is located in Jackson, Wyoming, and is specifically at the foothills of the Grand Teton National Park. It is currently managed by U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and their mission is to conserve native species and their land. The animals that utilize the area are all a part of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. U.S. Fish and Wildlife states that the refuge is not just for elk, but is also critically important for bison, wolves, trumpet-ear swans, bald eagles, cutthroat trout, and of course the bighorn sheep. There's approximately 24,700 acres of grasslands, wetlands, and forests on the refuge, providing the perfect habitat for these species. So diving into the history of the National Elk Refuge from a geological standpoint, it is described as a primarily glacial outwash plain and rolling hills with a narrow winding river. Fish and Wildlife continues to describe the refuge as it is surrounded by the rugged peaks of the Teton and Gros Ventre mountain ranges. So, looking at the history prior to the development of the refuge, there was a strong indigenous presence on the land. The most notable tribes are the Eastern Shoshone and Shoshone-Bannock tribe. Other tribes including, but not limited to, the Northern Shoshone, Blackfoot, Comanche, Crow, Arapaho, Gros Ventre, and Teton Sioux are worth mentioning as they have also tended to the land. Because the Teton Valley is so rich in biological diversity, a diverse amount of tribes would utilize the land. U.S. Fish and Wildlife includes that indigenous peoples would use the land seasonally and follow herds of bison, bighorn sheep, and elk to and from summer camps. The land provides many animals from elk to bear to bison, or other natural resources that are essential to survival, such as rivers, timber, and a variety of plant species. Unfortunately, there has been no direct information regarding how these indigenous tribes managed the land prior to the establishment. Before we dive into the establishment of the National Elk Refuge, some indirect actions that occurred that impacted the land for availability are important to be made aware of. As our history tells us, it was a long fight to obtain protected lands in areas, which meant that indigenous tribes had to be forced off their lands. There are many small and large actions that took place in order for this to occur. Two acts inflicted by the U.S. government that are relevant to the development of not only the National Elk Refuge, but almost all public, private, and federal lands are due to the Indian Removal Act and the Dawes Act. The Indian Removal Act was signed into law by President Andrew Jackson in 1830. This act authorized the relocation of indigenous tribes and was done so forcibly. Within Wyoming as a whole, treaties between the U.S. government and the tribes were negotiated in 1851, 1863, and 1868. The major act worth mentioning for the development of the refuge is the Dawes Act of 1887. According to the Wyoming Historical Society, the Dawes Act of 1887's policy's main goals were to civilize indigenous people through several means: self-sufficiency through agriculture, education, Christianity, protections of rights and punishment for transgressions as understood in English common law, and individual ownership of separate individual plots of land. However, this act ultimately forces tribes to assimilate to American culture and split tribes apart. Now that we have an understanding of how the land came to be, I want to bridge the gap of the history of the land to where it is today. The establishment of the National Elk Refuge came about when Stephen Leake, an outfitter and homesteader, came across a large amount of dead elk and noticed a decrease in elk population around the year 1909. Elk had been pushed out of the valley due to development of pastures and ranches, extreme winters, and excessive hunting. The community noticed the elk's extreme need for food during harsh winters. This inspired Jackson Hole residents to develop and dedicate 5 districts to appoint a rancher responsible for the feed of elk, and they sought funding help from the state of Wyoming, which was granted in 1910. The local game warden contributed 400 tons of hay to distribute amongst the 5 districts. Stephen Leake is responsible for the establishment of the elk refuge and was a major stakeholder as a hunting guide. He took towards the media to notify the public of the suffering of the elk and advocated for their well-being. This dominoed to the protection of the area. Overall, It was the community that came together to protect the elk and the area it is today. So here's a timeline that overviews the establishment of the National Elk Refuge and how it came to be what it is today. So pretty much in 1911, big things happened. State legislature was pushed, which then eventually dominoed to pushing Congress to support the state. And Congress resulted in appropriating $20,000 to feed and protect the elk. And then the following year, they appropriated $45,000 and decreed the creation of the National Elk Refuge. And this led to 1,000 acres of public land and 1,760 acres purchased towards the refuge. A lot of the original homesteaders sold their land for the refuge and was accepted on Congress's behalf. And then as we see, a bunch of conservation groups such as the Isaac Walton League of America purchased 1,760 acres and was offered to be a part of the refuge in 1927. And then in 1935, Congress provides $6 million for the acquisition of the land, which also helped the development of the Grand Teton National Park. And lastly, Roosevelt's executive orders added 3,783 acres, which brought the total acreage of the refuge to roughly 25,000 acres. Some important stakeholders to highlight and got the ball rolling for the refuge development is Stephen Leake. He is also known as the father of elk. This is because he publicized the issue, brought conservation groups together, state and Congress attention to the problem, and got them all involved to support the issue. And he did this by utilizing his writings. He also took photos, which you can see on the left side of the slide. And he went on lectures across the nation to advocate for this. Additionally, D.C. Nolan was the game warden that bought 400 tons of hay to donate to the 5 districts. He's also considered the first refuge manager. And then additionally, hunters and homesteaders who were dependent on the elk populations for survival are to be accounted for, as well as multiple conservation groups coming together to donate land towards the refuge. And this includes Isaac Walton League of America, which donated 1,760 acres, J.D. Rockefeller's Snake River Land Company, which donated 3,000 acres, and of course we have the U.S. government's involvement, Congress providing lots of funding, as well as President Roosevelt's executive orders in 1936 and 37. The overall process was highly supported by community members, and we saw this with the game warden and locals coming together, as well as conservation groups, all to come up with the solution of the problem, which has led it to be home to one of the largest elk herds in the world. None of this would be possible without the evictions of Native American tribes, and it is important to recognize the sacrifice that was made to enable the development of the refuge in Jackson Hole itself. Many of these tribes and bands within these tribes were departed across several states, including Wyoming, Nevada, Montana, and Idaho. It is noted that approximately 10,000 members of the Shoshone live on several reservations in Wyoming, Idaho, and Nevada. The largest reservation in Wyoming is the Wind River Reservation, where some of the indigenous people were relocated to. Another popular relocation spot for the Shoshone is the Fort Hall Reservation in Idaho. So as we discussed, elk herds were facing a decline in population due to development of homesteads and ranches, lack of forage, and survival rates in the winter, as well as overhunting. And this is the reason why it was singled out to be a protected area. And many people needed to have elk populations be stable due to the resource that elk is. The elk refuge would fall under the IUCN category of 4, which is a nature conservation reserve. IUCN states that conservation is through active management under this category, and the elk refuge emphasizes species management. The 3 threats the refuge faces are the animals being dependent on feeding grounds, chronic wasting disease, and invasive species, all of which interconnect in some fashion. Feeding dependent animals is a very controversial topic surrounding the elk refuge, and local residents consider it a threat. There is a consistent debate on what approach to take, as this domesticates the elk and other wildlife, which is not the end goal of the refuge. Feeding is highly important during winter months, as notably there is a lack of forage, which can lead to depletion of nutrients and calories, and as seen in the early 1900s, a decrease in elk population. But with anything, there are consequences, and continuing to feed grounds takes the wild and wildlife down a notch. Chronic wasting disease is another threat that intertwines with the threat of feeding. CWD goes beyond the bounds of the refuge and is a serious threat to all deer and related species. The disease causes fatality through development of neurological issues, causing them to be less present, and an example of this would be loss of awareness or loss of fear towards humans. Lastly, a threat within the refuge is invasive species. In 2022, Teton County Weed and Pests reported that 12,933 acres had been affected by invasive species. Specifically, I want to focus on the knapweed species. The spotted knapweed plant has a large impact on forage availability and pushes out native species that are essential or significant in grazing. The plant was first reported in North America in 1883. As of the year 2000, it has been reported in 45 of the 50 states and influences rangelands the most. It has been estimated by the U.S. Forest Service to have infested over 7 million acres. Overall, the history of the threat has impacted the focus threat as it has invaded a vast amount of land and continues to impact those lands negatively. The invasive species itself is a direct and indirect threat. It is not just limited to the bounds of the refuge, which is why it can be considered an indirect threat, but it also remains invasive across the nation. The plant itself has the capability of changing the environment due to its high adaptation ability. It has been reported at elevations of 1,900 feet to over 10,000 feet and can thrive on multiple soil types. It has also been shown to increase water runoff and reduce the soil-water infiltration, available forage, and wildlife habitat. At the time of introduction, there was a lack of awareness of the impact of the plant, what it is capable of, and how to manage it. This has only been resolved over time, however. It is still something that is needing attention, which leads to my next point. In order to provide the right attention and management tactics, there needs to be more funding to land managing agencies such as the U.S. Forest Service, Bureau of Land Management, National Park Service, and Fish and Wildlife Services. This would allow these agencies to incorporate more successful management plans and resources to eliminate the spread and environmental impacts it has on the landscape. As discussed, the spotted knapweed plant has a large impact on forage availability and pushes out native species that are essential or significant in grazing. But how do we manage it? Refuge manager Steve Callan states that the goal is to maintain the invasive plant along the Gros Ventre River and to protect the upland sites and meadows from further invasion. Some management funds come from local activities such as the Boy Scout elk antler collection sale, where a small fund from the sale goes back to the refuge, which is then divided further, allocating some funds towards invasive species management. Management also consists of utilizing volunteers to go into the field and pull weeds as well as the approach that focuses on the prevention of seed production through herbicide treatments. While this occurs, inventory and mapping is noted to have an accurate management reflection and develop management strategies. The highest priority of management is early detection. The Refuge uses herbicide, specifically Milestone, to control species and has been successful. When looking at effective community education, this is definitely shown as members of Jackson Hole come together to inform each other of invasive species and work on physically managing them together as well. A variety of groups such as Jackson Hole Weed Management Association, Teton County Weed and Pest District, U.S. Forest Service, National Elk Refuge, Bureau of Land Management, private landowners, and volunteers work together for an invasive plant control effort along the Gros Ventre River for 3 days, spraying and pulling weeds. It is highly important to keep your community educated about what is occurring environmentally to receive support in your management goals. As we saw, this worked out for the development of the National Elk Refuge and can be applied to the invasive species threat. The National Elk Refuge partakes in effective environmental planning processes through various routes. As discussed, management of the spotted knapweed in the refuge consists of spraying and pulling weeds. It is also highly acknowledged that the weed mapping is a part of the process to enable records of increased or decreased rates of species presence and how to reevaluate the next steps towards management of the plant. Dealing with threats over long periods of time is something that comes in nature with invasive species. Due to the spread and adaptability factors that come with spotted knapweed, it is no doubt that consistent management and attention will be needed. It will be very difficult to eliminate the species to only its native regions, and therefore, until that is done, or management of the plant to eliminate climate impacts such as erosion and water infiltration, dealing with this threat will occur over a long period of time. A management tool that is essential in dealing with the species over time is the weed mapping approach that allows managers to see what approaches have worked well, which ones didn't, if certain factors impacted the development or decrease in the plant's presence, and so on. Thank you for watching and following my presentation, and here are some of my references.